Excited to see it.
Okay, we're good. Okay, sounds good. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Welcome everybody to Jeffrey Generating Station. Appreciate you making the trip. Just a couple of kind of administrative items for you. If you go back out here to the left and take your first left, there are bathrooms on the little hallway down between here and where you came in the building, if you need them. There's a fridge full of water bottles back there if you need it. And if there's any coffee made, but we can probably whip some up if you need it. So anyway, thank you again for being here. Please feel free to let me know if you have any questions or need anything in particular as we get started. Objectives for today are to learn about surface and groundwater demand projections in the basin. Jason's going to give us an overview of Charleston Water's operations, and then I'm going to give you a briefing on how we operate Lake Barron and Lake Moultrie. So with that, everybody get a chance to look at the draft agenda for today. Okay, sounds good. Like to request a motion to approve the agenda then.
So moved.
Anybody second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Good. I'm gonna get it right today. Okay, awesome. Similarly, John distributed draft minutes.
Yeah, and Michael had one change to the draft minutes, which I did not distribute. Your change is related to.
Just for jurisdiction of record projects.
Right.
In there.
So it's the minor point that I'll update in the minutes to make sure that accurately reflect who has jurisdiction for a project.
Awesome. Yeah, that was the only thing I had. So anybody else have any concerns or comments on the draft minutes from our last meeting? Okay. I'd like to request a motion to approve the minutes from our last meeting.
Motion.
Second.
With the amendment.
With the
With the
amendment.
amendment.
Yes. Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, awesome. I think that's about all I've got. Okay. Thank y'all again for being here. And just let me know if you have any questions or concerns.
Okay.
Thank you. Good call.
Okay, a couple of items I want to remind everybody of before we start. Y'all should have received 3 invitations for some upcoming webinars. The first one's going to be next Tuesday. Dr. Nathan Smith from Clemson's going to do a webinar on agribusiness. Again, these are virtual. You just log in and attend. If you can't make it, it's going to be recorded. You can watch the recording later. Catherine in the back of the room is going to speak on the 24th about the statewide resilience and risk reduction plan. And then on the 31st, Steve Meyer and Dr. Joey Ballinger from DNR are going to talk both about freshwater and marine resources in the basin. So hopefully you can attend those webinars. If not, again, they'll all be recorded. Those are coming up in the next 3 weeks. And then our next RBC meeting is going to be on the 18th. And we'll be back at the Learning Center at Canal Park. And I never checked with you to make sure it was available, but I'm assuming it is.
I'll verify.
Okay, yeah. One other thing I wanted to mention, and if Jason's willing to give us an update, the drought exercise you attended last Wednesday. Any feedback from that or anything that was?
Sure.
You want to pass along?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I say it was well attended. A lot of people from a lot of different stakeholder groups. Hope Mazel, which is the state climatologist, did a great job walking us from everything from a minor or beginning drought of incipient, which most of the state's in right now, all the way up through the scariest scenario of a governor declared state of emergency, which we haven't experienced in the case of a drought. She successfully scared most of the stakeholders, and I think it was a well thought out exercise, a lot of really good conversation, and we are better prepared than we were before, but obviously there's always room for improvement. So,
okay. One of the attendees, I think, mentioned there was some discussion about drought impact on ag, and the discussion was centered around how that often happens before there's even a declaration of drought. Where
yeah, so there's been a long time debate about the differences between the state drought committee and state's drought declarations versus the U.S. Drought Monitor. Is complex, but I think more complex than that but it's just a fact of conditions, is that your soil-based stakeholders, whether it be the Forestry Commission or your ag, by the time you get to a moderate drought, it's a big deal. I mean, they're reliant on precipitation, crops are dead, they're probably not planting crops, there's probably already forest fires. And then reservoirs and rivers may not even really be feeling impacts yet. But then you get into the next two drought declarations that do start to affect rivers and reservoirs. But in the case of ag and forest fires, this water under the bridge, they're already toast. And how do you balance the different stages and impacts? Because it's just the soil-based stakeholders are going to feel it much earlier. It's just the way it is. Why we have reservoirs versus rivers. Rivers are much more resilient to drought.
We're probably going to start talking about drought response and drought management, getting the information we need to write Chapter 8 of the River Basin Plan at the April meeting. We're going to shift things around a little bit because we're still waiting on inflows from the Catawba Basin. So we may move up the drought discussion to April. So be prepared to talk about drought during the April meeting, our next meeting. Okay, I think that's all the news items I wanted to cover. Why this is not working. Online folks, can you hear us okay? You can, just somebody do a thumbs up. Just make sure you're able to hear us. Anybody online, if you're thumbs, yeah, perfect, thank you, okay. Public and agency comment, any members of the public online or in the room, or agency folks want to make comment? Okay. All right, I'm going to do a quick overview of what we talked about in February, which is a lot of information we covered. I think Brooke started out the presentations last time with a review of groundwater resources in the basin. Stop me if I say anything wrong, but I'm just going to hit a few of the highlights. She talked about the fact in the Santee Basin, there's 4 major aquifers: Gordon, Crouch, McQueen, and Charleston. Their extents and their recharge areas are different for each aquifer. That map shows both the kind of extent of each aquifer, and the shaded areas are the recharge areas, which, as you can see, for the Crouch and McQueen are just kind of a thin strip up near the fall line. The Charleston doesn't have a recharge area. It gets its water from the overlying aquifers, so infiltration through aquitards. Then the Gordon is kind of a unique recharge area that kind of splashes right through the Santee Basin. She showed a kind of composite map of drawdown area or cones of depression throughout the state, which covers multiple aquifers. The largest one's over kind of around Georgetown, which does get into the Santee Basin a little bit. There's smaller cone of depression in the Charleston area, historical, and then down by Savannah from pumping on the Georgia side primarily. Those were the kind of the more areas of concern on the coastal plain in our basin. That's one kind of near the Charleston area. This is a map of reported groundwater use in the lower Santee in 2023. And I think the point here we wanted to show is that ag irrigation is kind of in the central part of the basin, north of the reservoirs. Water supply is kind of scattered throughout. A lot of industry use of groundwater in the lower part of the basin, and some up to the upper part, closer to Columbia. Those pie charts on the right show the difference between surface and groundwater. If you look at the one on the right, excluding energy, surface water is still the primary source, 84%. Groundwater is about 16%. Hannah Hartley gave an overview of surface water resources in the basin. One important thing to remember is that the Saluda, the Broad, and the Catawba basins feed a lot of surface water into the Santee Basin. In fact, I think the next slide shows that's hydroelectric project. Okay. there's a lot of management of surface water upstream in the Santee Basin as well as there is in the Santee Basin itself. And all the stars are hydroelectric projects. Many of them are run of river, which means that the water basically just flows through. There's not necessarily management of the water, but many of them, especially those associated with reservoirs and the Catawba Basin, are actively managed. So they have controlled releases and they follow strict operating rules for the most part, and they follow drought rules as well. So a lot of management of water before you get to the Santee Basin. This just highlighted all the upstream water withdrawals in the Catawba, the Saluda, the Broad. One of the things I want to point out here is that there's a lot of water withdrawals in the Catawba Basin, the Charlotte area and all the municipal uses in North Carolina. 371 million gallons per day, which is double what's used in the Saluda and the Broad for agriculture, industry, and water supply. So more than half of the upstream withdrawals are in the Catawba Basin. And again, we're waiting on the Catawba modeling to be able to get inflows to plug into our model for the Santee. So right now that's holding us up slightly, and I hope that's not going to hold us up too much longer. But we're kind of at the mercy right now of the modeling effort in the Catawba Wateree Basin.
Wouldn't Duke have that pretty much squared away? Just,
We thought so. They've been updating their model. They've been kind of changing how the model works. And they're working, HDR is doing that work. They're working with RTI to, I think, add more detail to the model. So I think that's what's been holding them up. And honestly, Scott and I have been reached out. We haven't yet heard a latest update.
I just think they've had dams up there since the 30s, and so.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, they are doing some new modeling work. So there's some work had to do, but our understanding is that it should be done earlier this year. Right, my guess is they've had some delays in their own process, but too.
Yeah, but for our use, the old model would have been fine.
Okay. You could make that case.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, we're hesitant to use old model data when they're on the verge of finishing development of this new model. So at some point, if they're not ready and they continue to delay, we may need to go back to old.
You know how HDR is, they're always late.
Well, I don't know about that. I think they're just dealing with a lot of new data and a lot of additional modeling. So not really sure what the delay is right now. But, we'll be patient for a little longer, and then we may need to move to Plan B. Figure out what Plan B is. Scott, I think, pointed out in his presentation last week the seasonality, or maybe it's just Hannah, the seasonality of withdrawals. That top graph is public water supply, and those lower charts, there's not a lot of seasonality, a little bit. The upper one, which I don't remember who that was just an example. There was more seasonality, but then certainly in agriculture, they're need their water obviously in summer months, and they're using very little to no water in the winter months. So that seasonality is important, and that seasonality is reflected on the modeling that we do. I think Scott may touch on this a little bit more in his discussion of the demand projection methodology that's coming up here. But as a reminder, we're going to be looking at a number of demand scenarios, surface water demand scenarios. We're going to be looking at and modeling current use. We're going to be looking at fully permitted and registered use. So what if everybody pulled out at their fully permitted and registered rates? And then we have two planning projections, a moderate and a high demand projection. And we're going to focus on the high demand projection. We make decisions about water management strategies. We'll also probably look at an unimpaired surface water hydrology scenario. There's no regulation, no reservoirs, no withdrawals, no discharges, which is very different than what happens today, especially in this basin, given the amount of regulation upstream. Okay, and then I wrapped up the meeting last time doing an overview of the model that we're going to be using in the Santee Basin. And I touched on some of the model inputs and how we use the model and how it works. We'll do a refresher of that when we start to actually look at model results in a couple of months.
John? Yeah.
Yeah, we do the permitted and registered water use. Is that all the active permits? Because, I mean, there's a lot of permits where no withdrawals take place in a given year.
Yeah,
Is it just everything?
It's everything that still has a permit, whether it's active or not.
Okay.
So yes. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to the first of three presenters, which is Scott Harder. He's going to talk about water demand projection methodologies. He'll follow this up at the next month with actual demand projections, but today he's going to focus on projection methodologies. Is there somebody online that had a question, or it sounded like I heard someone speak up, but I'm going to pause and just make sure. Okay. That'll turn over to Scott. This is a little finicky, so I may advance it if it's not working for you.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. Yeah, my initial intent was to talk about results as well. I wanted to spend a little bit more time QA/QCing some of the data, and following up with a couple of users. Since we have some delays in modeling, I have a little bit more time to do that now. So I'm only gonna talk about the methods, and then the April meeting, we'll look at the draft results. Yeah, next slide, please. So before I jump in, I want to talk a little bit about forecasts, projections, and the differences. Because we're doing water demand projections here, not a forecast. And so talk about forecast. It's an educated guess based on expected conditions and actions, whereas a projection is oftentimes extrapolation of a trend or based on hypothetical scenarios. For a forecast, timeframes are limited by the predictability of future conditions, where for a projection can extend beyond the limits of effective forecasting. So one way to think about the difference there is if you're looking at weather, your 1 day, 3 day, 5, 7 day type forecasts. Those are forecasts. You have, you know what your current conditions are. You have reasonable expectation of what the future is going to hold for X amount of days. For projection, think of a climate model projection. That can go out 50 years. You're trying to predict the climate in 50 years. That'd be a projection. Extending way beyond the effective limits of forecasting in that case. So the forecast, your aim is to be accurate. Again, think whether you want to know if it's raining the next day. And a projection, its aim is to be informative. Okay, so remember, these are water demand projections. And I also say this because some of the assumptions I'm going to make or you're going to see here are probably wrong. So I don't claim that our 50-year projections to be accurate. Hopefully they're informative and good enough for planning purposes for this base. All right, so the methods I've used are actually documented in a report that was completed by Dr. Alex Pellet, who was with DNR and did transition over to DES. He has recently left the agency and took another job. So a lot of what you're going to see today is a continuation of his work. Also, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but in this report, he does document some stakeholder outreach efforts that help inform the methods documented in the report. He talked with a number of different stakeholder groups in collaboration with Clemson. He did some sector-specific sort of workshops to get feedback. And Alex tried to incorporate as much feedback as he realistically could. But given time and resources and data availability, he could incorporate everything. So just say these projection methodologies weren't created in a vacuum. As we've gone through some of the other river basins, this process, we have made some minor tweaks to the methods. We do make a tweak in one basin that usually carries on to the next one. But the core of the methods are still documented in that report. The general equation we use is really, really simple. Just saying our projected demand is equal to some estimate of baseline or current demand times the driver variable. Okay. So we're gonna go over 3 projection scenarios, and they're based on different combinations of this baseline demand and the driver variable growth rate. All right. So our baseline demand is based on either one of 2 things. It's based on either a monthly median water demand or a monthly maximum water demand, as determined from a 2013 to 2023 baseline period, which is a reported water use that DES collects, part of the permitting surface and groundwater permitting programs. So again, the baseline demand is either going to be a monthly median or a monthly maximum. All right. So what are our next slide, please. What are our driver variables? Some of these you can probably guess. For public water supply, population growth. For manufacturing industry, we use economic growth rates from the Energy Information Agency. For thermoelectric power, we try to estimate new electricity production or changes to electricity production in some cases. And for agriculture and golf courses, it's irrigated acres. Okay, next slide. So using that baseline demand and those driver variables, which are the factors, we come up with three different projection scenarios. First one is called the moderate projection scenario. And this is where the baseline demand is based on the median withdrawal volumes in a moderate or business as usual growth rate for the driver variable. For the high demand, baseline demand is the monthly maximum combined with an aggressive growth rate for the driver variable. All right. And then the high growth projection scenario is baseline demand is based on the monthly median, but we tie it to the aggressive growth rate. Now, the first two here, the moderate and high demand, are the main scenarios that you'll be dealing with and running your surface water assessments with. And those will be the ones documented in the River Basin Plan. I put the high growth projection scenario in here just for comparison purposes only, to give you an idea of how some of the assumptions you made can affect your results. Okay, so it's just for information purposes to compare to the moderate and high demand. So next slide, I'm going to go through some of the assumptions behind the moderate and aggressive growth rates for each of the driver variables. All right, so next slide. I'm going to start with public water supply, but do have to talk a little bit about the baseline demand for public water supply because there's an extra step here. So on this plot, on the screen there, I have three different plots. And just one thing I wanted to note was that this baseline period is an example. It's for illustrative purposes. This is an older slide. I need to update it. So it only goes to 2022 because it's in the previous basin. Just note our baseline period goes to 2023. All right, I need to update the slide. I'll get around to that at some point. So this is for a user. I don't even remember who it is. And again, it's just for illustrative purposes. The top is its reported monthly water demand or water withdrawals over that period there. And then the middle plot is the population served by that public water supplier. And that total population data comes from the Safe Drinking Water Information System. Did I get that right, Leanne?
I think so.
SDIS, or what do they call it?
It was.
Yeah. SIGWIS, is that what I call it?
Yes.
So we take that monthly withdrawal volume, reported volumes, divide by the population, and convert it to per capita water demand, which is the bottom plot there. Now, this isn't a residential per capita, because public water suppliers often supply industries, right? So it's per capita based on all the different uses of water supplier supplies. Okay, so don't think of this as a residential. All right. Next slide. And so what I do then is I take that per capita rate for every year, and I've just plotted them all here, and we take the median monthly value, right? That's our median demand for our moderate and our high growth projection scenarios. Then we take the maximum rate. That's the baseline demand used in our high demand projection scenario. Okay, so next slide. All right, so then converting back to million gallons per month, all I'm trying to show here is that I'm taking the median rate and the maximum rate, this is per capita rates, and I'm multiplying it by 2022 population. We revert back to total withdrawal volumes, and that's my baseline demand. Okay, so the blue would be the moderate demand scenario baseline demand, and the red would be the high demand scenario baseline demand. Okay, any questions on that so far?
I guess like this might not be the appropriate time, but like in additional projection models, when we're talking about public water supply, you mentioned, obviously industry pulls from the public water supply. And so what I'm very interested in is like a data center specific model, given the amount of growth we're having, especially within this basin.
A data center specific model.
Projection model.
Okay. We're going to get to industry, which does cover some. I think it covers data centers, but that's a discussion we can have. I'm talking about industry. Okay. So next slide. So now I'm jumping into the driver variable for public water supply, and again, it's population projections. So for the moderate scenario, we take information from the Office of Revenue and Fiscal Affairs, and they do project data out to 2038. So for the moderate, we just apply their projections to 2038, all right? But after 2038, any county with a positive growth rate, we just linearly extrapolate it out to 2070. And then for counties with a negative growth rate, we set those to 0 after 2038. And you can see there are a number of counties, Orangeburg, which kind of surprises me. It has a declining population, but it'll flatline after 2038. Calhoun, Clarendon, also flatline after 2038. And if on these plots, this is population projections for county, the blue corresponds to the moderate, the red corresponds to the high growth or high demand, the high growth or high demand scenario. Right. So for our assumptions for the high growth and high demand projection scenarios, any average annual growth rate lower than the state average, we set equal to the state average. And then all county growth rates are increased by 10%. So this is a really aggressive growth rate. And you can think of our high demand projection scenario as it's kind of an extreme case, but it's upper limit of the amount of water you might expect. It's really an upper limit. Yes, sir.
If you took those projections back 10 years and used the analysis against the real change, how closely do they match?
I don't know if did Alex ever talk about doing that or not. I don't remember if he did.
I don't remember that he did either. That question's been asked before, but I don't know that he's gone back and looked at the change.
I wouldn't be surprised if he has, but I honestly don't know. It's a good idea.
It'd be a good way to determine how sensitive your model is.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what it would show is that you're likely, if you look at the high projection, high demand scenario, you would be over predicting the amount of water, because you can see in a lot of those graphs. I mean, even in counties where we're seeing population decreases and they're expected to continue to increase. In high growth scenario, we're putting an upward trend, which to me suggests that, we're being conservative, which we want to be in our
Right.
high demand scenario.
Yeah, we tend to bias high on purpose. And some would say maybe too high, but these are the methods we'd settle on. Are any more questions on this? All right, next slide. All right, so moving on to manufacturing. For the moderate scenario, we use the projected annual economic growth rates from the U.S. Energy Information Agency. However, if there's a negative growth rate, set it at 0 until 2050. And then after that, we do give it a little bit of an increase. Again, just that idea of biasing a little bit high. And a 0.3% growth rate is applied from 2051 to 2070. But for the high growth and high demand scenarios, if the sector growth rate given by the EIA is less than the national average, which in 2023 was 2.1%, then we bump it up to the national average to have a more aggressive growth rate for all the sectors. And then if sector growth rates are greater than national average, the growth rate is increased by 10%. There's only one sector that was greater than the average growth rate that got bumped up. And I'll have a table of that next slide or two. So when you put all that together, growth rates will range from 0.3% to 2.6%, depending on the economic sector. And then if over 50 years, that gets compounded, that leads to a total increase from 6% to over 234% for different industrial sectors. Okay. So note that even with the economic growth rates here, water demand may not go up as fast as we might think as the industries become more efficient. As some industries that come in may turn to different products, more high value products that use less water. So again, we're assuming in this basin that the industries we see are going to be the same types of industries coming in the future. Okay, so that's one assumption we're making. All
The
right.
anomaly would be, as Riley said, the data center, right?
Yeah, well, we have Google. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, next slide. So here are the 2023 projected annual economic growth rates from the EIA. You can see most of these run 0 to 2%. There are some negative percent growth rates. You can see how they're broken down into different sectors. So we take the industries in the base. Of course, these are self-supplied industries we're projecting, right? And we assign their sector. So next slide lists the specific industries or most of the industries in the basin. And their moderate scenario growth rates based on the assumptions I just went over in the high demand scenarios. Now, my understanding is that Aguro is affiliated with Google. Is that right? So they're under computers and electronics. They have one of the highest economic growth rates from the 2023 projections. All right. So even the moderate scenario is 2.4, but then in the high demand, we added that 10% to get to 2.64% annual growth rate. So the data centers would fall in this category here, and I think that's a pretty good economic growth rate to consider for data centers. We can talk about, if we need to make some tweaks to that or not, but it should be accounted for in here. That 2.64% over time is compounded, right? Get pretty large. Now, we'll see that in the results next time. Okay. So it is being considered. We can discuss whether we're considering it well enough. We can have that conversation. All right. But I think it is being considered to some degree. All right. Next slide. So moving on to agriculture. Alex spent a lot of time looking at agriculture irrigation in the state. Researched, read a lot of papers, did a huge extensive lit review, looked at various data sets regarding irrigation and how it's changed over time. And Alex decided on a couple of sources to rely on for his growth rates. For the moderate scenario, he used a paper by Brown et al. It was back in 2013. But they were looking at withdrawals statewide, included the Southeast nationwide. They included withdrawals in the East Coast, the Southeast, and determined that from that paper, and he thought this was a reasonable estimate, that we expect 38% growth over the planning horizon, which equates to a 0.65% average annual growth rate in irrigated acres. All right. For the high growth and high demand scenarios, from this paper here from the Department of Ag, kind of looked at impacts of climate change and how that could change irrigation patterns in the future. So use some information there to deduce that Southeast irrigation would grow about 44% over the planning horizon with a 0.72 average annual growth rate. Now, over the past 10, 15, 20 years, we've seen a lot of new irrigation in this state. In fact, we've probably seen the growth in irrigation maybe faster than these annual averages here. But sometimes it's hard to get a good handle on growth in irrigated acres because it's based on reported water use that we get, or DES gets, and reporting's gotten better over time. So we've seen more irrigation withdrawals reported, but a lot of that's just better reporting, but some of that is growth in irrigated acres. Okay. So anyway, these are the two assumptions we landed on for the agricultural growth rates. You did get feedback periodically from the ag community, and they were okay with this. Next slide. So for thermoelectric, golf, mining, other categories, typically in other basins, we have projected growth for these sectors. The monthly baseline demand stays constant over the planning horizon. So for the moderate high growth demand scenarios, we just use the monthly median demand of the baseline period that I went over before, but that just stays flat going forward. And then for the high demand case, we take that monthly maximum, that stays constant going forward in the planning horizon. If we think there's going to be more golf courses, more irrigation of golf courses, more withdrawals, we can have that conversation. We can tweak our projections for golf course. But right now, we're just saying they're going to stay constant.
Cost declining.
If they get more efficient, water reuse, and things like that.
Well,
or people aren't golfing anymore.
well, we're tearing them up and turning them into subdivisions.
They're right.
From 120 golf courses on the Grand Strand to about 76 over the last 20 years.
Grand Strand, huh?
Yep.
I know there's new golf courses in Beaufort County. Yeah, there are. Yeah, there are.
One golf course on public notice, Basin, it's Orange Hill. Well, that one is, I mean, that was
It's space.
that one is a little bit crossing town. Yeah, and my John Island. Yeah, that one. I don't think they've constructed yet. They needed an extension of the construction.
They were doing like this until the mid 80s,
37.
and then in the
There's another one, but it's not
2010s.
the same. I believe it's more like an area, but I'd have to look it up.
Well-
Picture the golf industry is a very small user overall.
Yeah, it is. Just be conservative and we buy as high. I think those assumptions are probably safe. Okay. For thermoelectric demand, we typically rely on the integrated resource plans that each utility is required to put out every year, plus just direct conversations with representatives from utilities and feedback about any plans they have for additional power generation, additional plants, perhaps they're converting from coal to gas and how that can affect water use. We have those conversations with all the utility representatives. And next couple slides, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the thermoelectric demand and some considerations, some things to think about. So next slide. For this basin is a little bit trickier to do thermoelectric demand projections because you're downstream of 3 other basins that have a number of power plants in the lower Santee portion as well. So we not only have to consider changes to demand in this area, but also in the basins upstream. And so one potential site of expansion is VC Summer. And Michael, if you need to jump in a little more detail, you should feel free. But evidently Santee Cooper is looking to have an outside entity come in and try to complete the construction of nuclear facilities that were started and then by Dominion way back when. And never got SEG at that time. SCG at that time. And so one assumption we can make is that someone will come in and complete that project, and we'll have to come up with an estimate of what consumptive use will be tied to that plant. There's different ways we can do that. But a number of plants that are scheduled to be decommissioned throughout the whole Santee Basin, including Duke Energy's Cliffside Station up in the broad portion of the North Carolina, the part of the Broad Basin that's in North Carolina. 2030's Unit 5, 2048's Unit 6, scheduled to be decommissioned. Winyaw's expected to be shut down in 2030. Santee Cooper, and then Dominion's Watery Williams Station and the Catawba and Santee Basins are also scheduled to be decommissioned as well. So we have to think about, should we take these out of the future water demand projections after their end dates? Now, that's a lot of power we're losing potentially losing over the next 10 years. And so these companies have to make up for that power because energy demand is not going down. In fact, we expect it to go up, correct? So there are some new plants being considered. Ones I know of are outside the Santee Basin at this point, like the Kennedy site, partnership between Dominion and Santee Cooper. Putting a natural gas plant in there will make up for some of it. But there's also plans to increase solar energy capacity over the next 20, 30 years. So we expect solar energy as a source to grow as well to make up for some of that lost energy.
So none of the proposed natural gas facilities are in the Santee or in the study area?
Not that I'm aware of. I have talked to Dominion, I've talked to Santee Cooper. Now I will say that for Dominion's Watery Williams Station, they have to have some type of generation to replace what's being lost in place, guaranteed before they shut those plants down. And I don't know if Brandon's on the online. Just make sure I'm not speaking, but there is some flexibility to extend those beyond their scheduled phase outs if new power generation is not in place. Is that correct, Brandon?
Yes, you're correct.
So, well, it remains to be seen if those will actually be shut down or not, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Any potential for those to be converted to gas?
That's a question, Brandon. I haven't heard that yet.
Brandon, I don't know if you heard the question. Mike was asking if there's potential for these to be converted to natural gas.
Right. I mean, there's things we're looking at. I know, as far as Williams Station right now, we are actually in the process of building some gas peaking units there. They're actually called CT turbines. I've been trying to coordinate with Scott on that as far as the water usage on those. I haven't got hard numbers yet, but they're actually going to be pretty low. And I have even heard that some of those units can actually be air cooled. So as soon as I can get some better estimates on that, I'll provide that info to Scott. But uh, but really the function of them right now is to whenever you're hitting those high peak loads, again they'll be gas fired, so it's a real quick process to get them online and get them feeding into the system.
So are these being decommissioned because they're outdated and they can't be repaired?
Well, I know these are all coal plants, I believe. So they're probably trying to phase out coal as part of it. Now, why they're not being converted to natural gas, that's a question for Dominion.
Typically, that's going to be a supply issue.
Yeah,
If there's not a
Oh, yeah,
pipeline
that's
nearby.
right. Yeah.
Dominion can't get enough gas down here now for new subdivisions. There's a regulatory problem with their upstate pipeline.
Okay. Makes sense. Thank you. Any other comments on this right now?
And you might want to mention too, like in the broad, Duke has plans for like a small.
Next slide.
Next slide. Sorry. There you go.
No problem. All right, so this is my proposed approach, and of course, been on some feedback from you guys. So sorry this is so wordy, but some of the assumptions we're going to make based on the information I have now, based on feedback from utility representatives. I'm going to assume that all power plants slated for decommissioning will be on schedule, and their water withdrawals will be removed from future projections after their decommission date. I'm going to assume BC Summer will expand its nuclear energy capacity, and we'll have to determine some reasonable estimates of consumptive use. There's a couple of different ways we could do that. We can assume that the plants that were originally designed by SCG, they have water use, consumptive use estimates tied to that. We just assume that those would still hold true for whatever new entity comes in and finishes that project. Or we could just assume that Dominion's running, already has a nuclear plant there, just assume a comparable consumptive use tied to that plant. So no different ways we could do that. And maybe that's something we could talk more with Dominion and Santee Cooper about. As John had alluded to, Duke has plans to add a power plant to Broad Basin at their Cherokee site near Gaffney. This has already been incorporated in the Broad Basin planning. So Broad was one of I think the only basin, except maybe outside of the Catawba, that actually is projecting a new plant to be built, or wanted us to put a placeholder in for a new plant. It's kind of surprising. That's the only basin where new generation should anticipate. So we're going to include that. So that'll be part of this. And then, and Brandon talked about those CT turbines. We'll consider the additional consumptive use from those at PAR and hydroelectric facilities and at the Williams Station in the Santee Basin. And again, as Brandon said, we'll continue a conversation to see what kind of water loss you expect from those CT turbines, if any, depending on the cooling type. And then right now, I'm assuming no new power plants in this part of the Santee Basin, the lower Santee Basin. Okay. So those are the assumptions I'm making. However, we can evaluate some of the uncertainty of future energy demand by using the surface water availability model, or SWAM, to evaluate what if scenarios. What if we did have to put in a new plant and say had to withdraw from the lake or something like that? We can come up with those types of scenarios just to test as a sensitivity analysis to see, well, if we did have to have a new plant in a decent sized plant and consume some water out of the basin, what does that do for water availability? We can have those conversations as well. So I think that's my last slide, John. So any other questions or any other feedback to that approach or to the other methods in general? Probably reaching out again to some of you to get some additional feedback. But any problems with my approach to thermoelectric demand right now? Does that seem reasonable, John? Just use the SWIM, maybe test some stuff.
Yeah, that's certainly possible.
We're all still in production. What's its what?
That's a good question. It's, we're having to invest a lot of money on the wastewater side right now to keep it in compliance with some of the regs that are coming out. And at the moment, I mean, it's 2,400 megawatts, so it's a substantial piece of how we're keeping the grid stable. So I don't know exactly what the planned retirement date would be there, but I don't think we can afford for it to be terribly soon
Yeah.
because it's kind of cornerstone.
State of the art when it was built.
Yeah.
40 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say as to VC Summer, I don't personally have a lot of knowledge of what's going on with that request for proposal. And I don't know what the viability is going to be, but I do think, assuming something will happen, there's probably a good conservative approach for right now. We may have a better.
Best case scenario would be a decade before it's finished and running.
Yeah.
And that's in the Santee Basin, that's the whole Santee Basin. That's really the only, there might be, Catawba is different, but might have a few extra plants planned in their planning process. But when we get the data from them, we'll be able to share that. But BC Summer, that site at Cherokee that Duke has up there, Gaffney, BC Summer are the only two new plants anticipated or being talked about anyway in this basin, where everything else is outside the basin. Or it's sold. Or it's sold.
There are some other subtleties related to these demand projections that we haven't yet really talked about. We might have mentioned it, but have to do with future interbasin transfers. And one example is Charlotte Water, which is going through the process now with North Carolina DEQ and the EMC to increase their interbasin transfer from the Catawba Basin over to what ends up in the PD Basin. So it would be more water removed from what feeds into the Santee and discharge then into the kind of PD Basin, South Carolina standpoint. That's the largest one. Mooresville in North Carolina is also looking for an interbasin transfer to increase their amount. So we might just need to do some what ifs, consider some scenarios where a little more water is withdrawn from the Catawba Basin and discharged into the PD Basin. That makes sense.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Next, we're going to hear from Jason.
I don't know, I didn't try it.
Jason's going to talk about reservoir and source water management for Charleston Water System. Yeah, I think we're too far away, and my stick's over on the left side here. Actually, let me switch this and see if it helps you.
Jason, can you just speak up because we're back here with this engine running in this secret government facility underneath us. So I can't hear the speakers very well.
Yeah, no worries. Can you guys hear me?
Hello.
Can you guys hear me good?
Yeah.
Hopefully I can project the entire meeting. And
There you go.
it was going to be hard if I had to tell them to go forward each time. Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Jason Thompson, Charleston Water System. I'm their source water manager. Charleston Water System's been around a long time, so this presentation is going to be kind of neat. Lots of pictures, a lot of history, talking about a little bit of how we began and how we got to where we are today. And it'll be a little bit more source water centric in the discussion because it's relevant to withdrawals. But I hope everybody learns a lot today, and it's going to be really key to understanding how we manage the reservoir system and our tunnel system, but also where we really lie within the basin in respect to our upstream stakeholder, Santee Cooper, which is really important. And actually, this facility we sit at today is a critical component of what is important to us. We'll talk about that a little bit. So, introduction to Charleston Water System. We are a drinking and wastewater services commission. We are not a stormwater. So a lot of people complain to us about stormwater flooding and stuff like that. We have nothing to do with stormwater, so go talk to other folks for stormwater issues. We're an independent municipal agency, a commission of the Public Works. We do business as Charleston Water System. That was a relatively recent thing in the last decade or two, but in a lot of the historical documents will be referred to as CPW, or the Commissioners of Public Works. We do use the acronym CWS, not to be confused with Capital Waste Systems. So all these different name changes and acronyms, it's amazing people know who we are half the time. As far as our oversight, we have a board, and it's 3 elected and 2 ex officio. And then we have officers and about 430 employees. We've been at that number for over a decade now, really closer to 2 decades. As a lot of efficiencies we've implemented and stuff has allowed us to keep our staffing at a similar size, but a pretty big water utility as far as water utilities go.
Hey, Jason, that's like the most exciting toilet I've ever seen in my
Like
life.
that? This is how shiny my toilet is. I don't know about yours.
It's like really exciting.
Yeah, well, wastewater is probably, drinking water is important to public supply. Especially in case of emergency, you got to have drinking water. And drinking water is emphasized, especially in the developing world, as far as the importance of utility services. But the one most people take for granted is if you go to flush and it doesn't go anywhere, or worse, coming back into the house. And then also a lot of picking on wastewater treatment facilities. And if you've ever toured one, to see the way that the water comes into that plant and leaves that plant is literally a miracle of modern engineering. We'll just leave it at that. So where do we service? So think about where we are right now in this facility as we're like up here. So this is the Cooper. So we've got the Tri-County area. I don't have the counties delineated here, but we have Charleston County, Berkeley, and Dorchester County, most of them shown here. And we've got 2 different colored areas. Our treatment plants here, the hand-to-hand water treatment plant, that's what HWTP stands for. And the green area is our retail area. So that's everywhere we're metering and that we have direct services with. And that could include lots and lots of residents, hundreds of thousands of residents, but also it could include big retail customers. But then I contrast that with the dark brown areas, which are going to be our wholesale customers. So there's going to be people, we have one big master meter to that wholesale customer. Within these brown areas, there's a ton of meters we don't have access to. But just to go through some examples, as far as our retail area, you still have towns and cities, suburbs of the Tri-County area. A lot of them you probably recognize if you're from this area, but everything as small as Hollywood, not big Hollywood, our little small Hollywood, if you've ever been out there. Hollywood, Ravenel, Megget, if you blink your eye, you've driven through all 3 of them. They're not that big. But then you got more areas you may recognize like West Ashley, Daniel Island, James Island. But then you contrast that with wholesale water, and that's John's Water Company, St. John's rather, Mount Pleasant, Berkeley County, Dorchester County, a lot of the islands. A lot of folks don't realize it, but we go all the way out to Seabrook and Kiowa and all the way up to Isle Palms and Sullivan, and then the Megget, Ravenel areas out here. But the biggest thing I wanted to really point out is that we have meters in all the green area, and then we have, in some cases, for the brown wholesale areas, we may have a few metered connections into those brown regions, but we don't have the resolution of who's using what and when and how. That would be those wholesale customers that are going to have that data because they have the meter data for that. And then just really point out before I move on, that 20 to 25% of hand-to-hand water treatments, drinking water or potable water production goes to those brown areas, wholesale areas, okay? Let's contrast this. We're not going to spend a lot of time here, but this is our wastewater distribution system, our collection system. You don't want to distribute wastewater. You want to collect wastewater. Just a point back on the drinking water, though, about 5 years ago, the statistic was 1,800 miles of pipe. 1,800 miles of pipe. Okay, so obviously that's a lot of pipes spidering out to this distribution system. But that's a relevant statistic that we may talk about another time. With the wastewater, though, we still have the same delineation between retail and wholesale area, but we are zoomed in on the map a little bit. So our wastewater collection system is about a third or a quarter of the geographic size of our drinking water distribution system. Our hand-to-hand water treatment plants the drinking water plants rated for about 115 million gallons per day. Our wastewater treatment facilities rated for, I forgot, 35 or 40 MGD. So it's about a third of our size of our drinking water plant. There's a lot of other wastewater entities in this area that service or collect for wastewater. But it's complicated depending upon where people live. It's going to be who their drinking water bill's with and who their wastewater bill's with. But in most cases, everything's kind of connected. And then as far as our wastewater treatment plant, it's at Palm Island. Most of you, if you've ever been down to the Charleston area in the peninsula, you can't see it, but as you drive over into the James Island, Johns Island area, you gotta go over that bridge and you can see it to the left. As far as retail customers, you can see we've got a smaller list of both retail and wholesale, but just a very similar situation in that we have a lot more metering and telemetry within the green areas, a lot less metering and telemetry within the brown areas. And that's just the biggest difference between retail and wholesale.
A little bit about Folly Beach. I thought that they were on septic systems.
So especially when it comes to septic, it is a patchwork. And a lot of times when you look at a watershed-based plan and you think of like point sources and non-point sources, and you want to delineate septic for pollutant loads to the watershed, it's very complex to try to get good septic numbers. It's easy. We know where our collection system is, and we know where our collection system isn't. And there are certain areas, even within our collection system, like neighborhoods and such, that are still on septic. So I don't know. It's going to be my official answer.
I was just wondering, because you said it says like the wastewater is transported to Plum Island, like that piece.
Collected to Plum Island. So what's the question that you just said?
Well, I just thought that Folly was completely on septic systems.
No, I mean, I don't know the specifics about wastewater. Does anybody here know specifically for Folly, how much septic they have?
What's your impact fee on septic? You know, it's like that.
I don't know. That would be a city question or a county question, depending upon whether you're in the municipality or not. But when it comes to the collection system, and generally speaking, wherever the collection system goes, there's less septic. Most of it's been converted over. And then when you're out of the collection system, out of these brown or green areas, you're definitely out of our service area. And then you would go to other service areas like Dorchester Sewer, Berkeley County Sewer. And then once you're out of all of those, then you're probably in septic. But like I said, even within some of these areas, there's going to be hot spots of septic systems that have yet to convert over to a collection system. That's an ongoing challenge, and there's a lot behind that. And I just don't want to speak to it too much and not answer your question correctly.
I do believe Folly has some
Okay.
of a mixture, if I remember correctly.
I know when I did a watershed-based plan on Bushy Park Reservoir, there were 1,200 septic systems in and around Bushy Park Reservoir. And that was a lot more than I thought would be there. But it's just one of those things you've got to get out there a lot of times in the field and do your field studies to figure out exactly where your septic systems are. So let's talk source water real quick. So here's the state of South Carolina. We have our basins delineated. I'm not showing really the North Carolina portion of these watersheds, but I just want to highlight where our intakes are. We have 2 intakes in the Santee Basin, Bushy Park Reservoir and Goose Creek Reservoir intakes, and then 1 in the Edisto. So we're going to have 2 Santee Basin intakes, 1 Edisto. All 3 of those sources are conveyed to the Hanahan Water Treatment Plant via tunnel system. Goose Creek Reservoir, we're on it, but Bushy Park and Edisto have a tunnel system. So we have a 23-mile tunnel system from Gibbons Ferry to the Hanahan Water Treatment Plant, and about a 7-8 mile tunnel from Bushy Park to the Hanahan Water Treatment Plant. About 10 million acres all that are above our 2 intakes, so it's a pretty big watershed. I could have converted that to miles, but 10 million sounds so much cooler. The important thing we need to know for our planning efforts, though, is just to understand really, yeah, we're going to talk a lot about the Santee Basin, but it really is that bigger picture. And the CDM and the SWAM modeling folks really do have a task in trying to run those models and projections as accurately as possible, given the complexity, a lot of the complexities we've already talked about today. Real quick highlight too, most water utility, this is one thing that was talked about at the drought tabletop. Most water users only, whether it be water utility, power, agriculture, or any other thing, usually only have access to one resource, one source. And so the more you have different sources, the more resiliency you potentially have. And a huge component of Charleston Water's resiliency is the access to 3 different sources in 2 different basins, and 2 of those sources being reservoir, which is a huge component of our drought resiliency. So real quick, talk about our history. So Charleston Water's been around for over 100 years. Originally Charleston Light Gas, but it's been the Commissioner of Public Works since about 1905. But back in the 16 and 1700s, it was all groundwater and aquifers, shallow, then deep artesian wells. But then as the city grew, we impounded Goose Creek Reservoir there in Hanahan, South Carolina, right beside our first surface water treatment plant. And it was really in 1905 in the teens that we became a surface water utility. There was a little bit of groundwater use post 1905, but we really went to being a surface water utility. Geographically, that made more sense. Also made more sense from the distribution of that potable water supply. In 1915s, there was a big drought. And then I think it was 1917 or 18, there was a big flood. One thing you'll see in South Carolina's history is this propensity for big droughts, multi-year droughts, followed by really big rain events. We found that Goose Creek Reservoir wasn't as drought tolerant as we had hoped, but more importantly, the dam failed in the 19-teens, which will always be a bad thing for a reservoir. We've talked a little bit about that. So, and then, you know, there's a lot of history of war time and things like that, and just industrial growth in the area. But for the sake of resiliency, we started to supplement Goose Creek Reservoir while we redammed it with a very patchwork network of pumping. We pumped over the Marl Bluff from the Edgestowe Basin into the Ashley Basin. And then we actually utilized the Ashley River Basin via a dam at Bacon's Bridge and pumped the water out at Bacon's Bridge over into the headwaters of the Goose Creek watershed way up here in these swamps. So kind of the blue is where you've got kind of overland canals and natural streams and ditches. And then the brown is where we had more gray infrastructure ways of getting it there. But I think you would all agree this is not a very efficient way to get water from point A to point B. It really was an emergency necessity due to the issues on Goose Creek Reservoir at that time, giving us enough time to fix those, and we did. Fast forward into the late 20s and the early 30s, and we finished the Edisto Tunnel all the way from Gibbons Ferry to the Hanahan Water Treatment Plant, again about 23 miles. They've got two sources from the 1930s into the early 50s. Bushy Park Authority came in, and as part of a project to develop the industrial peninsula here, it was a peninsula at one time, and then also as a future resource for drinking water for the Charleston metropolitan area. It was an amazing project that was really key to our resiliency that we have today. But the reservoir was created in the 50s by diking the lower end, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but opening the north end through Durham Canal. So don't get too confused as we jump back and forth in a lot of the modeling between Telrace Canal and Durham Canal, but they're both man-made canals. Both are important to Bushy Park, but especially Durham Canal when we start talking about the Charleston Water System Reservoir. The first tunnel system connecting Bushy Park Reservoir to Goose Creek Reservoir was what we call the McDowell Tunnel section, which is about 2.5 miles. And basically, again, it pumped from this little tributary Foster Creek. We have a little intake on Foster Creek over into Goose Creek Reservoir. We can still do that today, by the way. And then, again, not the most efficient path, so that was extended to the plant, so that we didn't think we were having to deal with some of the water quality issues we were having in Goose Creek Reservoir. It's a shallow impoundment. It's very susceptible to seasonal taste and odor issues. And then in the early to mid 1990s, we extended that McDowell Tunnel to the Bushy Park Reservoir, the main body, so making an 8-mile tunnel. And this is where we arrived today at three surface water sources for Charleston Water System, all connected by a tunnel system, all feeding by gravity the Hanahan Water Treatment Plant. And we can utilize the ratio of all three of these sources, and we do change that ratio quite a bit, depending upon both water quality and water quantity considerations throughout the year. So those current sources. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but we'll talk about primary versus secondary versus tertiary. But it's really important to know that even though I'm talking about Bushy Park being our primary resource, we do blend almost all the time some portion of the Edisto. It's just the majority portion of our source water is Bushy Park Reservoir. But it doesn't mean we can't switch to a majority portion of Edisto, which we do sometimes. Again, many water utilities only have one source. So here's a picture of the lower part of Goose Creek Reservoir, a little over 500 acres. We've got a low-head dam. In great contrast to the Santee dams and dikes, we have at high king tide, and especially king tide, less than a meter of retention between or delta between the brackish water tidal side and Goose Creek Reservoir proper. This dam and dike is really a delineation between fresh and brackish water. It's not really impounding a ton of water, it's a shallow reservoir, but it is to ensure that Goose Creek Reservoir stays fresh for both Charleston Water and one of the industries on Goose Creek Reservoir that pull from there.
How deep is the Goose Creek Reservoir?
Say it again.
How deep is the Goose Creek Reservoir?
So the original channels, which kind of meander throughout, can be as deep as 20 feet. As deep as 20 feet. I would say the majority of it, we haven't done a recent bathymetric, whatever, topographical study of it, but average depths 5 to 10 feet is shallow.
When you blend from those three sources, isn't that from a plant operation standpoint kind of a nightmare? Because chemical differences,
No,
coloration.
talk about that a little bit more. I hope we'll get to do a water treatment plant tour of our facility, which would be a lot better. Give me more time to talk about that. But I mean, obviously, the sources are very different in water quality makeup. And we do have some challenges on the plant with the way that raw water enters two different trains on the plant. But as long as they're both behaving water quality wise, it's not that bad. And if one is so misbehaving, we can blend off of that source completely if need be. So that's a good question. I think they're both relatively easy sources to treat in the scheme of water quality. They're both good water quality sources, but sometimes it does make sense for a variety of reasons to treat more of one than another. So this is another view of the Lowhead Dam now this is more of a low tide view. So you got about a whopping 7 foot water retention between the brackish water side and the freshwater side. But you've got your dissipator on the Lowhead Dam. You know, Lowhead dams, they look super safe but not that dangerous, but they're a drown hazard. The dissipator helps with making it less of a drown hazard, but it also helps with erosion on the bottom side. And then you see this amazing historical woodwork from one of the original dams there that was left for the sake of erosion control. But also it's just really cool at low tide to be able to see some of the original pieces of the original dam. And I want to say that a lot of this woodwork was, exposed whenever the dam was rebuilt in the 80s. So it's been rebuilt a few times. The mid to late 80s was the last rebuild. But again, the highest you're going to see of water retained between the two sides is about 8 or 9 feet. And I've seen during pretty big tropical events and stuff, as much as about 3/4 of a foot of water going over this Lowhead Dam all the way across. That's a lot of water. And I want to say it's like 1,200 foot or something like that long Lowhead Dam, so it can put out a lot of water when need be. But honestly, this is the secondary. The primary spillway is on this far side. I want to say it's maybe 400 feet long or something, about a 6-inch difference between the primary and the secondary. Almost all year long, we've got water over the primary. Maybe a month or two out of the year, we'll have water going over the secondary or less. Edisto River source, obviously we're the Santee River Basin, but the Edisto River source is still important. It's an important resource for us, and it's especially important in as much as we can shift our withdrawals from the Santee Basin to the Edisto, or more likely the case during drought, Edisto over to the Santee Basin. But this is just a debris boom, forebay, and then you've got our trash racks or bar screens, and then this feeds the beginning of the 23-mile tunnel to the Hanahan Water Treatment Plant. 1928 view of Gibbons Ferry. Who's here been to Gibbons Ferry State Park? Beautiful park, but that is, a lot of people have been there a million times. They don't even know our intake's there. But a really neat looking site. Hand dug tunnel, 23 miles long, hand dug. wrap your brain around that for a second. These are pickaxe marks, and then you got drilling, and then you got a little bit of dynamite, because it's always more fun when you do dynamite.
What portion of y'all's water supply is sourced from like that instead of?
We'll talk about that. Good question.
That's dug in Cooper Marl.
I forgot geologically how deep the Cooper Marl, but yes, it's Marl. It's the Legacy Marl. It's but I'm not sure if it's Cooper or actually Marl.
Tunnel's not lined.
It is not lined. It's only lined at the intermediate shafts and where we have sluice gates. So, and we dive the tunnels. A lot of the tunnel maintenance has to be done by industrial divers, and we do that periodically, make sure everything's going good. A lot of people don't realize it, but we lay eyes on this infrastructure on a regular basis. And actually, we just overhauled the intake and some of the sluice gates in the tunnel a couple of years ago to the tune of $4 million. Let's contrast the hand dug Edisto with the bored Bushy Park tunnel. Slightly more modern digging approach to tunneling. And nowadays we have different bore and jack and other neat methods that you can do, maybe not for this big, but this was done in the 90s, and you can just obviously the rate of digging in the rate that we were able to do the Bushy Park tunnel in contrast to the Edisto, one was done within a year or two, the other one took half a decade. And then cost per foot dug, though. It's amazing how things get easier, but a whole lot more expensive with that technology.
Yeah, the Edisto tunnel was interrupted by the Spanish flu in what was that, 1918? So they had to pause it for a couple of years because of that.
But I have not heard of that. That's interesting.
There's a thing about it at Bacon's Bridge at the park there. They had a plaque on it, and I was like, wow, like just
Yeah, for those of you that didn't follow some of our, like the Spanish flu is the most comparative to the coronavirus that we had as far as global pandemic. It's very interesting history. We obviously have a few more tools nowadays than they did back then. There's a really good, not to divert too much, Netflix documentary on the Spanish flu. You should watch it. Let's go to Bushy Park Reservoir though. This is a very popular dam and dike for launching on both the saltwater and the freshwater side of the dike and dam for Bushy Park Reservoir. You kind of contrast very easily with this drone shot. Slight different water quality between the main branch and the Cooper, very brackish. I mean, if you were to imagine water running through a muddy marsh, it's what it's going to look like. And then you've got a freshwater reservoir. That's what it hopefully always looks like, but very contrasted as far as salinities, but also just settled water quality there. This is only the lower, maybe third. You can see William Station in the back right, a lot of industries on this peninsula to the right, Navy Weapons Station over here to the left, but we're looking kind of due north towards the Lake Moultrie Mirror, kind of that way. And then, like I said, this was built in the 50s by the Bushy Park Authority. Charleston Water System only assumed ownership of the project a little bit later than that. And then this is the INEOS intake. INEOS is one of the industries that we've already talked about today as far as the demand projections. And then we've got our Bushy Park Reservoir intake for the drinking water plant, Hanahan Water Treatment Plant. And then a lot of the industries are going to have their own intakes on that reservoir. Really contrast, a really neat picture. So we were looking here north. So this is kind of north to south, west to east, and this is the peninsula. And you can see in the 50s where there was no dam or dike, and this is where we were looking just now, the dam or dike that's there now. It's amazing. I've talked to even Department of Natural Resource folks that thought the dam and dike was some kind of natural thing that had been there forever. So, when you're talking about a region that has 50, 100, sometimes hundreds of years of history, the modern population, even those in relative positions of authority, may not always understand the history of the area. But a really cool article for those of you that love media. So Herbert Ravenel Sass was a big writer for the Saturday Evening Post back in the 50s. He helped write this the really neat newspaper article, which I love. I have this actually posted in my office because it's just such an interesting article from a lot of different perspectives. But I'm going to read a lucky freak of geography near Charleston, South Carolina is responsible for a new engineering project that's going to give our water short land a huge reservoir at incredibly small cost, yielding 10 billion gallons a day. So we got a few exaggerations here, as you would expect with every media article that's ever written. It wasn't as such an incredibly small cost because the Bush Park Authority went out of business, which was to the benefit of Charleston Water System, the Commissioner of Public Works, as we were able to assume that indebtedness and eventually own the reservoir. So it wasn't that cheap though, if you're going to go out of business. And then 10 billion gallons a day is a slight exaggeration. We do understand the hydrology pretty well, and it's not 10 billion gallons a day. It is a lot of water though. But go read that full article. It's a really cool article to read, and it really gives you a perspective of what was going on at the time. This was during the time of the diversion project, which we'll talk about a little bit later with Santee Cooper. It was also in and around wartime. It was also at a time where water resources were first and forefront in the state legislature's mind, as they were just trying to better understand water availability across the state. But it was in its infancy compared to any modern day water planning processes. So Bushy Park project is very dependent upon the Santee Cooper diversion project. So the Bushy Park project was enabled by the Cooper diversion project and subsequent regular freshwater inputs into the Cooper. We'll talk about that as Michael gets to his presentation. The Bushy Park project, the dam, the dike, the Durham Canal changed where Bushy Park impoundment would receive water from the Cooper. We'll talk about that in a second, geography-wise. And then essentially just changed it from south up to north. How are we doing on time?
You're okay.
Okay. The interconnected relationship between the diversion project and the Bushy Park project are well documented in the corresponding legislation. You have South Carolina Act 355 of 1953. Then you have South Carolina Act 1178 of 1964. You also have a ton of studies and contracts. There was a lot of studies by the Corps and FERC and Charleston Water System and the Water Resource Commission, WRC. Who in here remembers the WRC? You probably all have WRC studies in your library somewhere. But there was a lot of studies around what is the right amount of water to put down the Cooper. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in Michael's presentations. And then those have been cauterized in recent contracts and the FERC license that Michael talked about. So this is kind of grayed out. So, a very simplified view of the same area we were looking at. You've got the peninsula, and then you've got the Goose Creek Reservoir, Navy Weapons Station area. But let's just highlight the water bodies in dark. So you've got the meandering Cooper River, East Branch, West Branch, and then just to the north, the lakes. But pre the Bushy Park project, you had Foster Creek, Back River tributary, this little kind of creek called Chicken Creek draining into this very brackish water estuary, which drained into the Cooper River, very near where the saltwater, brackish water DNR line is officially delineated right now with DNR, which means even back then and even now, the brackish water, like super high brackish water salinity levels go way up here into the Cooper. So for really all standpoints, water quality wise within this area it would not make a suitable hydro project. It wouldn't make for ag. It wouldn't make for industry. It definitely wouldn't work for potable or drinking water treatment. So we contrasted that with what happened in the 50s or mid 50s with that Bushy Park project. The dam or dike, which we highlighted, was added to the south. No water passes through that dam or dike. If it ever does, that's a big problem. And then we opened up Chicken Creek to, there was a little bit of a creek on this side too. But if you've ever driven this area, it's a fairly uniform depth all the way from Back River all the way to the west branch of the Cooper. But it drastically changed the water quality in Bushy Park because all of a sudden we're pulling from the fresh waters that are in the west branch. But more importantly, we're pulling closer to where the Panopolis or Jeffries projects discharging those regular releases into the west branch of the Cooper. And then all the industries that are up on this peninsula here pull from Bushy Park, and then they discharge to the Cooper River. But a big component of the Bushy Park project was the fact that this was a deep water port. And so it really, it allowed Charleston to do some industrial growth that we now see. But unfortunately, a lot of that industrial growth did not come in time for the original owners of the project, Bushy Park Authority. They thought a lot of people would flow in within 5 to 10 years. It took a little bit longer than that, but it all worked out in the end. Lake releases versus downstream withdrawals. We'll talk a lot more about this probably when we get to modeling. Michael will talk a little bit about it in his presentation. But the contracted Jeffries powerhouse releases, where we're at, is from Lake Moultrie, obviously just upstream up here. Average a weekly flow of 4,500 CFS. That's within the FERC license. And that's the number that all those studies settled in on. That comes to 88,306 million gallons per month. That's a lot of water. Since 1978, the USGS and Santee Cooper have worked together to measure the releases of these contracted releases. They've been in the ballpark, depending upon which data set you use, of about 100,000 MGM per month, so a little bit higher than the contracted. And then if you're going to look at median versus mean, which if anybody knows, I love to talk about median and mean. We don't have time for that today. But if you don't understand the difference, especially in relevance to the state's hydrology, and you have a couple hours, come talk to me. All permits with withdrawals downstream of Lake Moultrie's Jeffries project, downstream of where we're standing today, are currently within Charleston Water's 2 reservoirs, Bushy Park Reservoir, totaling 25,000 MGM, or within Goose Creek Reservoir, 1,300 MGM. It's important to understand that Goose Creek Reservoir, though in the Santee Basin and downstream of here, is pulling from its own Goose Creek watershed. It's not pulling from the Cooper. But the Goose Creek Reservoir withdrawals are relatively small compared to the total withdrawals from Bushy Park Reservoir. But to my knowledge, there are no other withdrawals, or at least being reported, in the Cooper River watershed other than within these 2 reservoirs. And the contracted release volume, that 8,800, actually closer to 100, is 3.5 times the total downstream withdrawals within Bushy Park. And even if you added in Goose Creek Reservoir, and most of that withdrawal is non-consumptive or discharged back into the Cooper due to it being power generation. Also, we get additional supply from precipitation from the local watersheds, but the vast majority of the water supply that we're pulling from within Bushy Park is going to be from the releases from the Panapolis or Jeffries project. CWS's withdrawal and drought plan. We can talk about this more in depth when we get to drought plan, but I just want to talk to you while I had the floor. CWS withdrawal permits, Bushy Park Reservoir permit for Charleston Water is 150 MGD. SO permits 287 MGD, or million gallons per day. And the Goose Creek Reservoir permit is 10 MGD. This does not include our industrial users in their permits. They report their own usage in most cases. But CWS resiliency comes from its access to 3 sources. The CWS drought plan is activated based on the DNR drought committee declarations by county. Charleston Water does sit on the drought committee for the Southern Drought Management Area. We also look at stream flow triggers on the Edisto within our plan. Obviously, we're monitoring stream and reservoir flow triggers throughout the basin, on both basins, but as far as our plan, it calls out the Highway 61 Gibbons Ferry station, which we financially support. And then specific conductance for conductivity or salinity, all convertible to the same thing within Bushy Park Reservoir. You know, the reservoir is an open freshwater estuary. It's an impoundment that we've created, but it is tidally influenced and is influenced from the dam releases. And so it's critical that the dam releases are sufficient to overcome any kind of storm tide or tidal influence. And so that's all monitored throughout the Cooper Basin and within Durham Canal. Durham Canal is kind of the line in the sand as far as where we're monitoring water quality. And then Goose Creek Reservoir levels, we're monitoring that about every week just to see how we're doing as far as that contingent or backup source for us and the mill. Somebody asked a really good question. How much do we pull from each source? How many of you have ever utilized box and whisker plots? Many of you love box and whisker plots. Okay, we won't talk too much about box and whisker plots, but we could spend an hour on this. the important thing is to understand that a box and whisker plot is just a way that you're gonna delineate data. And you can see here, we've got percent on the x-axis. And so at any given time, this, I believe, box and whisker plot included about 7 or 8 years of history. You can see that our blend of our sources usually favors a higher percent of Bushy Park Reservoir. So you kind of are broken into quartiles, lowest quartile, second, third, and fourth quartile. Mean and median are kind of be right here. So mean and median or average, we were in the high 70% Bushy Park ratio most of the time. Most of the time we'll be at a minor ratio of Edisto. So, in the mid 20s% Edisto. Of that is going to the potable plant versus industrial supplies, even less than that. But it's really important to understand that we can actually go to quite a high ratio of Edisto if need be, and we have done that, and we can do that for water quality reasons. And then more importantly, we can feed very low flow rates of Edisto when we need to go to Bushy Park due to drought declarations and drought contingency planning. And then currently, and really in the last recent history, our hand water treatment plants utilize very little Goose Creek Reservoir, and even then for very short periods of time.
Didn't it show on the previous slide the permitted withdrawal from the Edisto is a lot higher?
Yeah, it is. So, I mean, you got to look chronologically, time-wise, when these facilities were designed. And the Edisto forebay and tunnel, when it was built, it was the primary source. And so it's capable of pulling more than we typically do. We've utilized about a third of that permit, but we've never utilized more than a third as of history goes. And then on Bushy Park, we don't have quite as big a permit, 140, but we've utilized, close to triple digits on that for narrow windows of time. So between a third and a half of our permits we've typically utilized. And as I think you mentioned, some permits use very small portions. Some withdrawals use very small portions of their permits. We use, I would argue, a reasonable amount of our permit in order to allow some contingency and ability to shift sources. So source blend changes can be triggered based off of water quality and water quantity considerations. Okay, so I need to wrap this up. So our drought plan, just to sum it up, our reservoirs are much more drought resilient than the river. So as we go into drought triggers at Gibbon Sperry on the Edisto, we're gonna, as those drought triggers are reached in stage-wise fashion, we're gonna blend more and more reservoir and switch our any industries on the Edisto tunnel over to Goose Creek Reservoir as well. So basically switching from less drought tolerant river sources to more drought tolerant reservoir sources. But we really don't want to do a premature change to Goose Creek Reservoir, because worst thing you could do is drain down your contingent source before you get into the real bad drought, and then you got to go back to the river because you don't have a choice. CDMS enacts various types of production reductions based on drought severity, but basically depending upon our drought declarations by county and as triggers are reached, we do various levels of voluntary and mandatory restrictions of first non-essential uses, and then all the way up to including all uses as the drought gets worse. And this is the kind of thing that all the different withdrawers and non-withdrawing stakeholders talked about and modeled in the drought tabletop last week. Just understand that our source water tunnel system is interconnected, and so we are able to move water around by sluice gate position changes, pumping changes. It's all measured, and we have very good control of the tunnel system, and everything's reported to DES annually. And then Goose Creek Reservoir can be supplemented by both Bushy Park and Edisto sources, because it's right in the middle of those two sources. And we have clear wells and tanks both on the plant and in our distribution system to help us level off our demand production during drought, but also we can kind of imbalance our raw water production versus drinking water production as needed to do for projects and emergencies. Any questions that haven't been asked? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jason. We'll do a short break before we wrap things up with Michael. It's 10:36. Let's go until 10:45. So if you're online listening, we'll start up again about checking it out at 10:45. Anybody know? Everyone.
I can just stick with that.
People have a knack of
They don't want us to
recording with traffic on their way in. What's thousands and thousands of acres, tens of thousands of acres.
What does Charleston Naval Weapons Station do with Bushy Park?
So the good thing about them is they don't do a lot as far
Yeah,
as
that's what.
land disturbance.
Yeah.
So they're actually pretty good.
You ready, Mike?
Yeah, also.
All right, our last presentation is, Michael's gonna talk about history and operational strategy, then we're gonna follow this up with, kind of a short tour, and then we'll do lunch.
Sounds perfect.
So you've got, I don't know, half hour, 40 minutes, as much as you need, and also from there.
Okay, all right. Appreciate y'all's time this morning. I'm gonna just hop right in. So we are, as Jason mentioned, kind of here at the, really the start of Santee Cooper, at the Jeffries Generating Station. And this picture you see right here is of the foundation of this facility being dug down into the limestone that is native to this area back in the late 1930s. So just to give you a little bit of context about Santee Cooper in general, this concept for Lake Marion, Lake Moultrie actually predates our existence. There was a private company out of Columbia that was looking to improve navigation between Charleston and Columbia back in the mid-1920s, called the Columbia Railway and Navigation Company. And they were the ones that actually went and got the Federal Power Commission authorization to move forward with the project. Their timing was really bad. They received it in 1926, and as many of us probably know, Great Depression hit in 1929. They were unable to get financing for the project, and thus it didn't move forward. So in 1934, in the midst of continued economic struggles here in the state, the South Carolina legislature formed Santee Cooper to give a mechanism for moving the project forward. And so that happened in 1934. And once we were formed, we went and obtained project funding through the Works Progress Administration in the mid-1930s. The project got started in construction in 1939, and this entire thing was built in 3 years. So not just this facility, but our spillway, which I'll show you pictures of, about 40 miles of earthen embankment dam and dike. So it was a huge project, 160, 170,000 acres. So a lot of clearing as well. There were 12,000 people working on this job at the peak. So pretty crazy scale. And the first power was generated here at this facility on February 17th, 1942. This graphic kind of gives you a sense of really what the primary motivators were for project construction back in the 30s and 40s. There was still a desire to improve navigation between Charleston and Columbia at the time. That has largely just panned out to be recreational at this point. It never really developed as a commercial interest. But as we'll see in a little bit, there is still a capability for some commercial traffic because of the scale of the lock that allows us to pass boats up into the reservoirs. Hydroelectric power was obviously a big piece of the desire for construction of the project. This station is about a 145 megawatt station, which is roughly enough power to provide for about 150,000 homes on a typical day. It's also here for flood control and health betterment, which is an interesting component that a lot of folks might not think about. Malaria was still a significant issue in this area in the 30s and 40s, and a big part of what we were tasked with these reservoirs was trying to mitigate that. So moving forward, talk a little bit about our federal authorizations for the project. As I mentioned, the first license for this project was issued in 1926. That was a 50-year license authorization from FERC's predecessor. So FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And I guess I should back up a little bit and let y'all know those Those folks are the federal entity responsible for authorizing non-federal hydropower in the country. They've also got some other responsibilities around grid reliability, natural gas, some other utility-focused portions of what we're doing in the United States. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on their hydro licensing component. We were formed in 1934, shortly after the license was issued. First power was produced in 1942. Our first license for the project expired in 1976. 3 years later, we obtained the second license for the project in 1979. That was a 30-year license. It came with a few more water quality and property management requirements than the original license did, because there was a recognition that those things mattered, and that responsible development around the lakes was going to be an important piece of how you move forward. Monitoring and maintaining water quality was also something that became more of a priority for us as that license was issued. That was a 30-year license, and it expired in 2006. And there was roughly a 25-year effort towards getting this latest license that we received in January of 2023. A lot of the time, these processes extend out because there's pretty extensive negotiation over stream flow and provisions for fish passage and a variety of other really environmental and wildlife focused provisions. The main hang up for us this past time was around management of short nose and Atlantic sturgeon in and around the rivers below the Santee Cooper project. So that's primarily what held things up. But we did get a new 50-year license back in January of 2023. And as a result, I've been very busy for the last 2 years trying to get us started on.
I'm sorry, can you say that again? Did you actually say it has to do with fish?
Yes.
Can you explain why? Like,
Yeah,
you
so
didn't want to hurt the fish?
So
You wanted
the
fish?
big hang up for us is we are the first hydro project on the system. And so when you build a dam, you do block the migration patterns of certain fish.
Okay,
And for us, the species of concern are American shad, blueback herring, American eel, and then short nose and Atlantic sturgeon. And both the short nose and Atlantic sturgeon are endangered species. And so there's a particular focus on trying to improve things for those species because they are limited in their population.
The advantage is they locked in the striped bass, so.
so you could fish and get
It's the
from that.
upside.
Okay,
Yeah. So yeah, the main hang up in getting this latest license issued was around protection measures for those species in particular. And we'll get to actually look in a little while at some of what we're doing to support American shad and blueback herring, because we utilize the navigation lock as a fish passage lock during the spring when those fish are here. So it's possible, depending on what our timing is, we might get to catch a lock operation here a little bit. Won't be able to see the fish, but it's at least a neat process to observe. So we are therefore licensed through 2073, which will go well beyond my career, and probably the careers of most of the people in this room. But the good news for us is that it ensures the future of our reservoirs, which are important resources for the state and for the low country in particular. Somewhat Jason talked about really becomes more important. Okay, so we are standing in the Jeffries generating station today. As I mentioned, it's a 143 megawatt station. We've got 5 units here, and it's integrated with our navigation lock, which you can see in this picture over here on the right. We also have a small 2 megawatt generating station at our spillway on Lake Marion, which is right here. The other piece, the other hydro on this system is operated by the Army Corps of Engineers at St. Stephen. Jason alluded to some of what we'll talk about as it relates to the Corps, but the primary reason that they own and operate a hydro on our lakes was to divert water back to the Santee River, because the flow into the Cooper River was found to be causing accelerated siltation in the harbor, which was causing issues with navigation. So we'll get into that in a little bit. I mentioned we've got nearly 40 linear miles of embankment dams and dikes. It's just flat in the low country. And so it took a lot of earthwork to make these reservoirs. And it's the main surface water source for the whole Charleston, South Carolina area. We've talked about Charleston water extensively already. Santee Cooper also has 2 surface water plants, one on each reservoir, with an additional 48 million gallons per day capacity. This will look familiar to y'all. I'm not going to belabor this because we've looked at this pretty extensively, but main thing I just want to reiterate is that we are at the bottom of a large watershed. And so it means the stream flows are pretty high. And it means there's decent amount of opportunity for hydroelectric generation, but we also do occasionally have large flood events. Talk a little bit about how we manage those here in a minute. Zooming in just a little bit more to give you a sense of the scale of Lake Marion and Lake Moultrie. Lake Marion is about 100,000 acre reservoir. Lake Moultrie is a little bit smaller, but it's deeper, which is why the bulk of the hydroelectric generation on the project is located on Lake Moultrie. It's still 60,000 acres, so a substantial reservoir in its own right, connected by a canal. Here, the Diversion Canal, and then the St. Stephen Hydro Facility that Corps operates over on this rediversion canal, which was constructed in the 1980s. So to talk a little bit more about that rediversion project, this graphic on the left shows basically the flow orientation before the Santee Cooper project existed. Really, the Cooper River was only tidal before Santee Cooper built Lake Marion and Lake Moultrie. It was brackish, it was tidally influenced, there was really very little freshwater flow. And the Santee River, all of the water originally ended up in the Atlantic Ocean between McClellanville and Georgetown. When Lake Marion and Lake Moultrie were built, it diverted the vast majority of that flow into the Cooper River, right here at the Jeffries Generating Station, with a little bit of water, about 500 cubic feet per second, being passed into the upper Santee River, or excuse me, lower Santee River here, and then flood control occurring on Lake Marion back into the Santee River. And as we talked about a minute ago, siltation of the harbor was found to be an accelerated issue as time went on. And so Santee Cooper and the Army Corps of Engineers ultimately came to an agreement in the 1960s to divert the majority of the water back to the Santee River to mitigate the siltation rates in the harbor. Recognizing that in the interim, the Bushy Park project had been built, and therefore some fresh water did still need to be passed down the Cooper River in order to protect that water source. So what we ended up settling on was that 4,500 cubic feet per second on a weekly average basis that Jason referenced earlier. And basically what that means is St. Stephen's facility accommodates any other excess inflows that we get until it gets above a certain level, and then we have to use our spillway to pass large flood events into the Santee River. Any questions so far? Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
So we're physical constraints here. But if we're still playing area. Let's see, what about creating dam situations to release more water?
So
Just you have flexibility to distribute water from Santee Cooper. A little more flexibility. They wouldn't have to do the rediversion.
yeah, so the main issue there is that you've only got about 40 feet of head versus almost 80 here. And so it ends up becoming a kind of bang for your buck decision from a power generation perspective. Because if you think about the water pressure equation, depth is a squared term. And so for every foot, you're getting significantly more energy out of the release of that water. And so releasing the water at the Santee Dam just doesn't provide a tremendous amount of power. The 2 megawatt unit that we have up there passes about 650 cubic feet per second of water. Whereas these units out here are probably 5,000 cubic feet per second or so of water, but they produce 36 megawatts. So it's pretty significant improvement in efficiency for every foot of additional depth that you get. And that's why there wasn't an investment at Lake Marion.
Some history on that too. There was a bit of a war between Santee Cooper and the Corps over that project. It finally settled in, I want to say 1981. It was slated to go to the United States Supreme Court, and Santee Cooper's board of directors decided to pull back and let it happen.
So ultimately what did happen was the Corps built the St. Stephen facility and they operate it, but we are able to dispatch it to meet our power system needs, and thus get all the power from it to compensate us for the lost capacity here at Jeffries, because that 4,500 cubic feet per second weekly average is roughly a seventh of the instantaneous flow capacity of this facility. So it does limit our ability to leverage the asset. So before built the St. Stephen facility to help kind of compensate for that loss. This is just one more quick look at the lake system in kind of a schematic form, showing the location of each of the major structures. Here today, the St. Stephen facility does discharge back to the Santee River about 37 miles downstream of where Lake Marion ends and the Santee Dam. And all this is slightly above what we looked at in Jason's slide presentation. Give y'all just a couple of real quick data points about the reservoirs and our rule curve, which dictates the target elevation for Lake Marion on a daily basis. The main point here is just that these reservoirs are flat, and the result is that area increases pretty rapidly as the lakes fill up, because there's just not a lot of topographic relief in the low country. It's why we've got 40 miles of embankment dam at night around the reservoirs. Okay, this is our rule curve, and what this is essentially here in gray the elevation that we attempt to keep Lake Marion at on a rolling basis across the calendar year. This is intended to basically capture higher inflows kind of late in the year into the early months of the year, when we know that rainfall tends to be a little bit higher in the upstate where the bulk of the drainage basin is located. And then it holds the reservoir high during the summertime when we know we've got recreational interests, a lot of people on the lake, protects the water supply during a period where we do have lower inflows. So I'll give you a little bit of a sense of how that matches up to our 30-year average for monthly inflows in the Lake Marion. As you can see, kind of December, January, February, March, and April tend to be when we have the highest inflows into the lakes, which is kind of, it's opposite of what the local precipitation patterns are. The summer times when we get the rain here, the upstate's not typically as wet in that time period. So just to kind of give you some sense of how that matches up. The idea here is also flood control. We want to make sure we've got room in the reservoirs to try to mitigate as much flooding into the Santee River as possible. And so dropping the reservoir elevation in this time period gives us that extra margin to account for what's going on in the upper part of the basin. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Blue dash line is the bottom of the operating.
Yes, yeah, it's a foot and a half below the rule curve on a rolling basis.
Different.
When we hit that elevation, that's when we would start enacting drought contingency plans. So,
Sorry, I don't want to let you know you're setting up whatever y'all are.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so that's when we start enacting drought contingency plans, which for us primarily just dictates which hydros we can run, and at some point would result in some considerations for reducing flow into the Santee River to protect the flow at Jeffries if we absolutely had to.
You're still releasing.
Yeah. Yeah, until we just absolutely physically can't do it, essentially is what it would come down to, just because there's a recognition of the criticality of that water source for the region.
That's
Right. Yeah, so just gonna briefly touch on minimum flows on the project. This upper table is really just highlighting the main change that we had as a result of issuance of our new license in January of 2023. Historically, on the Santee River, there was a requirement that we pass 500 cubic feet per second into the river on a continuous basis. Our new license requires that slightly more than double from May to November, and then get almost 5 times as much flow during the spring spawning season each and every year to try and enhance the habitat and attraction flows for those migratory species that we're interested in helping to protect. So that'll be impactful for us. There's already kind of in some years a little bit of a water balance struggle. So we'll see how it goes. Hopefully we continue to get wet years and it's not an issue, but that remains to be seen.
How much does that boost the brackish water versus the fresh water in the Cooper River?
So
How far, does it move a lot during spring
It
events?
does.
Goes way
Pretty
down
much.
the river?
Pretty much the whole distance of Bushy Park Reservoir is the tidal move. So there's like 4 or 5 salinity monitoring stations by USGS.
Yeah.
And I mean, fresh water at our earthen dike can be as low as like 500 salinity units. I mean, specific conductivity units, they can be 30,000. So several magnitudes delta depending upon tide, king tide, storm tide, that kind of thing. So quite the delta and quite the geographic movement if you look at all those different stations.
I just know when you go down through the tail race into the Cooper River by boat, you can almost visually tell
yeah,
Vegetation changes.
where it normally is.
right.
But then you can also see where you go there at certain times when things have moved, it'll move back and forth.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And that accounts for some of the difference in the 4,500 minimum and the actual flow.
Yeah.
Because we do, I think, pretty regularly get salinity alerts resulting in us.
Try, the intent is to keep it
Right.
close together.
Right. Yeah. It's a balancing act, trying not to
Yeah.
cause the Corps too many headaches in the harbor, but also trying to keep Bushy Park from ever having a salinity incursion because we recognize what that impact would be. Yeah, so I won't belabor this point because we're talking about it pretty extensively. But we do have a seasonal goal to release about 5,600 cubic feet per second on average at the St. Stephen facility because they also have a fish lift there. And so the desire is to provide attraction flow for those migratory species to come up into the canal and then get into the lift so they can get into the lakes and spawn and continue the life cycle. That's primarily for American shad and blueback herring.
Do you still have the big congregation of fish below the spillway?
To some extent, yeah.
Because you used to go walk on them. I mean, it was just thick.
Yeah, and we'll be putting in passage at that location as well at some point in the near future. That was another requirement of our license. And we're working on some concepts for that right now. Okay, last thing I've got for us is really, I'm gonna just step through what a typical daily hydro operation decision might look like. Yeah, go ahead.
So I mean, how much does the lock and dam act as a fish lift for y'all? I mean, I know it's not managed like that.
So we actually have just installed high resolution sonar units to try and quantify what our shad and herring passage is in this facility. But we think based on some historic data from DNR, it's in some good years, it could be upwards of 500,000 shad, maybe 100,000 blueback herring is possible. Those are typically about what they get at the St. Stephen facility as well. So we do run this lock 6 times a day, strictly just for fish passage during the spawning season.
Are you saying you like put the fish in an elevator and take them up so they can go
They
make up
swim
other
in and
fish?
go up.
It's so
Yeah.
romantic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like Valentine's Day.
Yeah, so we've got a siphon that you'll see running today when we go up there that provides a little bit of oxygenated attraction flow, pull them into the lock. And then we'll run it just like a boat lift and let them out into the reservoir. typically let the gates sit open for a period of time. So efficiency is pretty decent, surprisingly, for a lot.
You know, just to have something rigged down there where they counted them.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, again, one of these things I figured, yeah, just kind of project terminal.
Yeah.
Fish passage or question.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully we'll have a good year this year. We'll see. Okay, so in general, this is kind of the workflow that our Energy Control Center folks are using to make dispatch decisions on our hydros. We're looking at the USGS gauges upstream. The National Weather Service also provides forecasts at the Congaree, Columbia, and then the Watery River near Camden that we utilize as feed points for our model. We've got an in-house lake management application that then takes that data, looks at storage in the lakes and our ability to pass water downstream, and helps us kind of juggle inflows with outflows.
All that's computerized now, right?
It is.
We used to do a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
That was,
Yeah. Well, actually, I think in the next week or two, we've actually got an AI supplemented version of it
really,
getting ready to go live.
got any copies of the old spreadsheets?
I haven't seen one, but
Do you want one, Frank?
No, I've got one.
So really, for the Jeffries facility, the main decision point is going to be looking at that weekly average flow, how much of the water we've used up already in the flow week, which runs Saturday to Friday. And then they'll be looking at energy usage patterns for the week, just based on what the weather is. So this morning, y'all heard the hydros running because it was cold. As we transition into warmer months, those would more likely be running in the afternoon when everybody's starting to get home from work, running their air conditioners, getting dinner ready, et cetera, et cetera. And then the St. Stephen hydro discharge is really where we would capture any inflows above what our base flow condition is. So that's our opportunity to get generation from excess inflows. Otherwise, we have to spill the water, which we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Publish the plan. It goes out to a variety of people who have stakes in it. On occasion, we've got, right now we've got DNR at the tail race of this facility 3 times a week doing sturgeon sampling. So we work around their schedule to try and optimize all of that. It's communicated to the public as I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. And then from there, we move into actual dispatch. So I'll just briefly step through kind of what that actually looks like. This is a rainfall event. Actually, it's a 14-day cumulative rainfall map from back in January. It's not a significant event. It's just one I grabbed for exhibition purposes. So may not even match up with the hydrographs I'm going to show in a second, but what we're interested in is anything that fell in the basin. So we're evaluating that primarily by looking at the USGS gauges that are upstream of the project. Congaree River near Columbia and Watery River near Camden are kind of the 2 main ones that we're keeping an eye on to evaluate what inflows are going to be. And then we have another array of gauges downstream to help us with minimum flow compliance monitoring. So this is a hydrograph from that Congaree River gauge at Columbia for back in January. And so we're interested in the historic data, also interested in the forecast. Typically, what we see is about a 3-day lag in what the flow value is here relative to what we're seeing inflowing into Lake Marion. And so we account for that in our modeling to make sure we're not dropping the lake too quickly relative to what the actual stream flow is doing.
Is it still about 7 days from the top of the watershed?
Probably. I don't know that value quite as well offhand. This is the Watery near Camden. Main reason I included a second one here, because we used the gauge, but also wanted y'all to note this pattern here. That's Duke dispatching their hydros at the Watery station. And so the main takeaway is that this is a highly regulated basin. And as a result, in most situations, we are kind of at the mercy of what's being released upstream. But these patterns in January if I had to guess, you're gonna see peaks in the morning and the evening when people are running their heat primarily. Because Duke's gonna be dispatching their hydros in the same pattern that we are. Okay, so all those data points get fed into the model that Mike mentioned a minute ago. This is what that output looks like right now. Got our Lake Marion rule curve here. In the dash line, this is the actual Lake Marion elevation. We are only really targeting Lake Marion's elevation because Lake Moultrie's elevation is very dependent on flows from the diversion canal between the lakes and then what we're dispatching in the hydro stations. And so we've got a lot less control over what that looks like day to day. So there's a recognition that from a management perspective, Lake Marion is really where you need to adjust for high inflows. This blue line shows total discharges from the lakes. And then these couple of other lines are just a rough estimate of what that computed inflow is going to be from upstream. So at the end of the day, we are using that model to make decisions about hydroelectric dispatch. We've talked about Jeffries. This is the St. Stephen facility. I will say this time of year, if you're looking for a good field trip, DNR operates the fish lift for the Corps over here, and they do tours. It's pretty interesting. It's worth the trip if you're ever out that way. They've got an observation window that'll let you watch the shad and herring come by as they lift them up into the lake. It's pretty neat operation. So this just summarizes the various flow conditions you can see at each of the stations. We do have that 4,500 cubic feet per second minimum weekly average here at Jeffries. But what that means is hour to hour, you could see anything from no flow up to 28,000 cubic feet per second if we were running every unit, if we had to. That doesn't happen often because you burn through this allotment very quickly. And so this morning was abnormal a little bit, and if we were running 3 units. Typically, you would only see us run 2, just because that allotment moves, it goes very quickly when you're using much more than that. The Santee spillway has a 600 cubic feet per second continuous minimum flow right now. That'll be increasing like we talked about here in about a year. And then the core St. Stephen facility flows there are going to range anywhere from 0 to about 22,000 cubic feet per second on an instantaneous basis, just depending on what we have coming into the lakes and what the power system requirements are at any given time. Okay, so the Santee spillway, it's located at the bottom of Lake Marion, and this is our only method of flood control on the project. I say only, it's probably not fair to this structure because it's 6/10 of a mile long. There's 62 gates that are 50 feet long by about 18 feet tall. It's got a flow capacity of up to about 800,000 cubic feet per second at normal lake elevations. And if we were getting a probable maximum flood, which would be the kind of the worst possible case hydrologically in the basin across the entirety of it, Lake Marion continued to rise. It could get upwards of 1 million cubic feet per second if it had to. Now, we obviously hope we don't ever see that because it would be catastrophic both upstream and downstream, but it is capable of moving those types of inflows if it had to.
What's the highest?
The highest we have ever operated it, I think, was actually last year in response to Hurricane Helene, and we hit about 170,000 cubic feet per second for a brief period of time.
It gets,
I think we had roughly 20 gates open, at least partially, at that point.
That's what's still running diversion.
Yeah.
This facility kind of full.
Well, this facility, we're even in high inflow events, we're limited to what the contract says we can do with the Corps. Doesn't mean we don't ask, but
Total outputs. Keep it in.
what's that?
I was just trying to sum up the total outputs.
Oh, yeah. Roughly, probably would have been close to 200,000 cubic feet per second at the peak. It wouldn't have been for very long, but
You created some flood storage in the reservoir too, so.
We did. Yes, it did. We started spilling it at this facility, I think about 3 or 4 days in advance of receiving the floodwaters, because inflows peaked at, I think it's almost 280 or 300,000 cubic feet per second. It almost hit the flood record, which on the Santee River was, I think it's about 316 cubic feet per second at a gauge that's just downstream of the project back in 1916, which incidentally was the other catastrophic flood that Asheville's experienced in
Same thing,
recorded history.
same story.
Yeah. Actually, that was back-to-back storms.
Yeah.
Which is kind of wild.
Almost just one storm short of a PMF.
Yeah.
What year was it?
1916. Yeah,
How many, you said this was 6/10 of a mile long.
3,400 feet. Yep.
If you really want to rush, walk out on one of those tail walls while they're spilling.
Yeah,
It's awesome.
all right. So I'm going to just flip through a couple pictures. This is a spill event we had back in 2003. I couldn't tell you what the flow rate was for this one. But as you can see, this structure can move a lot of water in a hurry. And this just kind of demonstrates what the tail race of the spillway can look like during an extended spill event. This is maybe a 40 or 50,000 cubic feet per second spill because we're only using the 6 middle gates on the structure. But the capacity of those is about 50,000 cubic feet per second at the top.
Those are gang operated with one, every other gate has to be lifted individually.
Right. Yeah, we've got a crane that operates the other 56 gates, or 2 cranes that operate the other 56 gates as needed. So this just demonstrates how flat the lower part of the Santee River floodplain is because the water stages up quickly and it takes a long time to go away. All right, last slide I've got for you, I think, just talks about the various ways we communicate this data. We do have a website you can go to that'll give you some idea of what the dispatch schedule is on a daily basis. If you Google Santee Cooper Lake Line, you can find it. There's also a phone number you can call. And we do a separate notification to people in the Santee River floodplain below the Santee spillway if we're having to operate that facility because it does cause significant flooding on occasion downstream. It's better than it would be if we weren't here. That'll always be something I want to reiterate to people because the lakes do capture a good bit of the flood inflows each and every year. We do still have to spill most years, but that peak's always going to be lower than it would have been if our lakes weren't here. So, and with that, I have taken enough of y'all's time. Y'all have any questions for me?
You didn't brag on the project. The locks were the largest single lift lock in the world when they were built.
Yeah.
And the Santee North Dam was the second longest hydraulic fill dam in the world and still in the top 5, I think. It was quite an engineering marvel. Harz Engineering Company out of Chicago designed it. They moved their office from Chicago to Moncks Corner during the process. The lakes were filled quicker than they were supposed to be because World War II started and McAlloy Metals and Charleston needed power, so they closed the spillway off, which is the reason you had the dead forest in the upper lake. They never had a chance to clear it.
Yep.
So the history of this thing is significant. If you really want to delve into it, Dr. Edgar wrote a book about it, and I'd encourage all of you to read it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You'll never be able to build this project today.
I still feel like the legislators in South Carolina must have been pretty smart. I mean, leadership must have been pretty smart to let all.
FDR's chief of staff was from South Carolina.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because sometimes it seems like politicians can never get anything.
Well,
But this is amazing quick work for a state or federal.
FDR was looking for ways to put people to work. And again, the chief of staff, his chief of staff came from South Carolina and was intimately involved in the early aspects of the navigation and railway efforts.
Who was? I bet his last name is on everything.
His name escapes me.
I can't remember either. I meant to grab, we've got a book of pictures from construction that I meant to grab. I'll try and bring it in April to our next meeting. If anybody wants to flip through it, I think Baker got to look at it earlier.
It's a shame his name is not remembered because if it weren't for him, this project never would have happened.
Like, when I first moved here, Strom Thurmond was so famous. And I think he was stuffed. I think they taxidermied
No, he
him and
wasn't.
put him in a seat and pretended he was alive for a while. And then they finally had to admit that he died because he had so much influence. It makes you wonder about like Ravenel and Thurman and,
He and Hollings both,
yeah, right.
both sides of the aisle. They got a lot of stuff for this state
Yeah,
during their
I
time.
really think they did.
I thought y'all do a great job though. With the influx of water like 1,000-year flood when it hit. I kept going out to the lake and watching that water. And y'all just did a tremendous job handling that water.
Think of the engineering though in 1930.
Yeah.
To plan for something like
Yeah.
that. It's just phenomenal to me that,
It's
no
amazing,
computers.
Yeah, it's
Just-
amazing something that old
Yeah.
works that well, but it does.
So the rule curves that we looked at that provides the target elevation,
Yeah.
that's, if I'm not mistaken, that was original to the project, which blows me away.
That's
Yeah,
what's got the elevation at the top of the gates, 76, 80.
Yeah, the tools that our predecessors had access to, they did a darn good job projecting what kind of the pattern tends to be.
Yeah.
For a huge watershed.
Mhm.
So anyway, it's been fun to be involved in because it's such a critical piece of the Low Country's history, and I hope we've conveyed its importance on an ongoing basis.
I was just thinking, this reminds me of the Hoover Dam, this building. And that was started in 31 and they did it in 6 years. They finished the Hoover Dam in 1936.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's
just
similar
different water
timeframe.
management.
Yeah. Go ahead, Scott.
Question for you, Jason. Updated post presentations on the planning page.
Should be.
I don't have a problem with that.
I thought I forgot it.
All right, before we wrap up this part of the meeting, I just want to give you a preview of what we're going to talk about in April. We mentioned this a little bit. Scott will be back, hopefully, and present the actual water demand projections by sector and for each planning scenario. Either Ashley or Leanne are going to talk about groundwater management plans with capacity use areas. Brooke's going to follow that up with a kind of a groundwater outlook. So again, in lieu of the modeling that we had hoped to do, we're going to do more of a kind of conceptual desktop snapshot of groundwater, and Brooke's going to lead that discussion. And then we may fit in a drought management discussion. We might also potentially do a field trip. I spoke with Mickey earlier today. We would like to get out and see some ag operations in the area, but April may be a difficult time to do that. I think you guys are pretty busy getting stuff growing in April. But
Yeah.
there's a possibility we may piggyback a short tour either in April or May after the meetings to look at ag and ag operations in this area. But that's still to be determined. What we probably won't likely do is get into the surface water modeling results in April. I think we'll need another month pending receipt of inflows from the top. Again, just a reminder of the virtual webinars coming up over the next 3 weeks. And I think that's it. I think we'll wrap up the online portion. So the online attendees, thank you for your attendance. We're going to grab lunch and do a quick tour. But I appreciate you guys hanging on. Did anybody online have any questions before we close out? Nope. All right. Well, hearing nothing, thank you online folks. We'll stop the recording and shut down the Teams invite. Michael, do you want to go ahead and be on the agenda, go ahead and do the tour and then get lunch? We could flip that if people want to eat now, but I don't know.